Good day, everyone. Here in this episode, we're talking about radical discipleship. We're looking at some key figures in the Bible, particularly Mary, the Theotokos, the Mother of God, and her radical commitment to the triune God. Now, before getting started, we might ask, what is radical discipleship, and why are we talking about it? Now, these are two great questions. So what does it mean to be radical, and what about discipleship? Now, let's begin with radical. Let's start with the term. First of all, what does radical mean? And then we'll look at why be radical. Now, what does it mean? Well, originally the word was used in English to mean having roots or being connected to what is most essential. So it comes from the Latin term for root or branch. But in the last little bit, radical has taken on new meaning. And today it signifies being unconventional. Now, by unconventional, we mean someone who doesn't just follow the norm or do what everyone else is doing. And part of being unconventional or radical also can mean someone who lives on the edge. So someone who isn't hiding in the middle of the herd, but on the outer edge, which isn't always a comfortable place to be, because most humans love to be stuck in the middle of the crowd, where you don't get as much notice. And that comes with its own advantages and disadvantages, depending on who's a part of your herd and where the herd is heading. Now, just a quick aside on herds. I'm sure you've heard the bit about zebras and their stripes, like why do zebras have stripes? Black and white lines, after all, make terrible camouflage on the Sahara. By contrast, lions, who are tan with patches of white and brown, well, they have very good camouflage, which is totally needed to sneak up on prey. So why do zebras have black and white stripes? Well, it's because predators can't just attack an entire herd. They need to single out an individual zebra. And why single them out? It almost sounds a little bit vicious, doesn't it? Well, if you've grown up watching lots of movies, especially those starring animals, you'd be forgiven for not being entirely aware that some animals make a living by preying upon others. So the lions single out a particular zebra in order to coordinate attack. But if all the zebras look the same and blur as a massive unit, well, the lions can't keep track of who's who, which makes the stripes incredibly useful if you're the zebra, and frustrates the lions trying to sink their teeth into their next meal. Now, all this means that lions generally have to look for the weak, young, or old zebra, and that strays from the pack, or one whom they can identify and then hunt down. So herds can be very useful. Now, thankfully, we're at the top of the food chain, so humans don't have to worry about convincing lions that pound for pound, zebras are actually way better for the feline diet than urbanized primates, or that they should adopt a vegetarian palate, and so forth. Now, what does this have to do with radical? Well, again, if we think of radical, meaning those on the edge or unconventional, it reminds us of a further insight. So being radical also takes lots of effort. So why is that? Well, you're not always taking your cues from those on your left and those on your right. Since you're not just following the masses, you really need to think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then exert a whole lot of effort to do it. Now, this is not just to separate yourself from the herd, but also to resist them from pulling you back into the center. And those of us who do sit with the masses, we can appreciate certain radicals from the safety of our armchairs. Say, for instance, star athletes. I mean, those are people who spend a whole lot of time, effort, energy, and totally stand out from the crowd in an admirable way. There's other radicals who stand apart from the rest for all the wrong reasons, and they spend time, energy, and effort on doing something destructive. So just because you're radical doesn't mean you're doing something good necessarily. Furthermore, we said a bit about herds, but they're not all that bad. In fact, herds, there's great wisdom that can be found within them. And herds, those are the people around us who keep us in line. And in fact, much of our day involves feedback from others that are telling us when they find us annoying, when we're out of line, and so on. So herds aren't inherently bad. And in fact, without them, you and I wouldn't be here, since humans live in packs, and most generally we don't survive very long apart from them. All right, so that's a bit on being radical, unconventional, on the edge of the masses. But the second part to being radical is why be radical? So we looked at what it means, so why be one? Well, one quick answer to that question, why be radical, is why do anything half-heartedly? I mean, for one, it's really inefficient, so pedestrian, so typical. And if you really apply yourself in the right direction, all sorts of benefits can arise, especially if you're doing something that serves a purpose and benefits others. Now, I was trying to think of examples of radical things a person can do. I was listening to a podcast a ways back, and there was this British DJ. He said the most punk rock thing a person can do today is to get married and have kids. Very radical, indeed. Now, you should never really trust DJs too much for all sorts of reasons. And we don't want to provide you with ideals that are beyond your station at the moment. So we can forget about that for the moment. But if I'm thinking of a radical thing a student can do, well, one thing that comes to mind is studying for a test. And why is studying for a test so radical? Well, it's so unconventional. Very few people do it, at least amongst the students that I observe. Now, second, if you are going to prepare for a test, why do it half-heartedly? I mean, why not give it your all and push your limits? Now, the same thing goes for anything you practice for. And plus, when you do something intensely, when you really get locked in, and say you take a drastic measure like you turn off your phone, TV, and any other distractions and get into a quiet space and really, really focus for like an insane 30 minutes. What could happen? Well, you could really improve. And again, this applies not just studying, but to music, sports, and all sorts of other things that require practice and skill and developing it. Now, but again, if you're half-hearted and entertain all sorts of distractions, you can put in 40 minutes, an hour, and not achieve the same results. So intense focus has its reward, not just being more efficient, but also in the long run, too. If you do this studying over a couple of evenings, you might actually remember valuable stuff for the rest of your life. Now, I, for one, achieved so-so results in grade 9 science, but to this day, I can still remember some of the material I studied for on my first Science 9 unit exam. Like, take your typical definition of matter, for instance. It's something that has occupies space, so has a volume, and a mass. Now, we learned other things about neutrons, protons, electrons that were generally quite helpful about learning about the rest of the world during the rest of my life. So, being radical in intense bursts can have its benefits. And one last thing about being radical, why do it? Because if you excel in the right direction and move beyond the confines of convention, all sorts of people will love you and thank you if you can do something that actually benefits the entire group. Now, put it another way, we're not just thinking of being radical for the sake of standing apart. We're thinking of moving beyond the regular in order to benefit and serve everyone else. Now, here's a quick example. One radical artist who stands apart from pretty much the rest of them is Michelangelo. And not long after he's died and gone on, people still flock across seas and continents just to look at what he's produced. Now, why is that? Because the beauty in his radical art speaks to us in a profound and deep manner. So yeah, it's intensely beautiful, and we'll save up all sorts of money, buy a plane ticket, book hotels, and all the rest just to see his works in person. Now, we might not end up as famous, but we can still become radical artists. This could be in the way we sing, play guitar, mix paints, or make it rain on the court. People still appreciate the effort, intensity, and dedication that we've taken and invested to do something that the rest of us can't really do all that well necessarily. All right, that's enough with radical stuff for today. How about discipleship? Well, very quickly, what does discipleship mean? Well, a disciple means simply someone who follows another for the purpose of learning. So, someone who follows another for the purpose of learning. Now, you could be a disciple of any great or not so great thinker. Their belief systems, they're numerous, and some thinkers, for instance, like J.J. Rousseau, Karl Marx, or my personal favorite, yes, you guessed it, Jesus Christ. Those are different thinkers who have different disciples. Now, two other things quickly here on discipleship. Everyone is a disciple. So everyone is a disciple, and we follow one line of a thought or another. So that means discipleship isn't quite the same as radicalness. Now, why is that? Well, for one, if everyone's a disciple, we can't help it. So we learn from others by osmosis. What that means is, when we start to learn to talk and walk, since then we've been picking up things just by being around others. So you might not be able to name the philosophers or thinkers who developed ideas that you live by, but we still mold our life to certain sets of principles. It's a requirement for being able to function well in this life. So let me give you an example here of certain ideas you might live by, even if you don't know the thinker who came up with it. Say, for instance, if you've ever said this, or maybe you've heard someone say this: I'll believe anything if science can prove it's true? Well, if that's the case, then you owe a debt to logical positivism. And some British thinkers like A.J. Ayer, who said that the only truth claims worth making are those that can be empirically verified, which essentially means the only things worth knowing are the things that can be learned in science class. Otherwise, don't waste my time. Now, many people might not have a clue what empiricism means or logical positivism, or maybe they never even heard of A.J. Ayer, but they still live by his ideas. They're one of his disciples. Now, maybe that's not for you. Maybe you live by a different motto. Maybe you say this: who are you to judge me? If I think something is true, then it's true for me. Well, if you take that as a key motto in life, then you're taking on the teachings of the relativists, and they stretch all the way back to a very famous mathematician known as Pythagoras. He's also a philosopher. And Pythagoras said, man is the measure of all things. And what he means by that is, if my heart tells me something to be true, then it's true. All right, so that's relativism. Now, quick aside here, Aristotle, who lives a little bit later, he points out some major flaws with this line of thought. But in any case, 26 centuries later, relativism has made a comeback, and many people live by these teachings. So they're disciples of the relativists. Now, the point here is that we're all disciples of one teacher or another. Now, again, we might not have formally learnt our teacher's name or formally studied their philosophy, but we latch on to their ideas. And why? Well, it's in order to function. If we don't have ideas and a framework to figure out the world, well, then we won't. The second point about discipleship is this. If that's the case, so if it's the case that we are all disciples, then wouldn't you want to be a disciple of the best teacher who's ever walked the face of the earth? Now think about that for a second. If it's the case that we're all disciples of one thinker or of another, wouldn't you want to be a disciple of the best, the very best teacher who's walked the face of the earth? Now, I'm not saying it would be easy, because great teachers often make great demands of their students. But if it is the case, then let us learn who we are learning from and sit at their feet, or at the feet of the best teacher known to humanity. All right, now that's all for the moment. Let's pause. We've covered quite a bit of material and review here really quickly. All right, number one, first of all, what does the word radical mean? Okay, second of all, what is the root of the word radical, or where does the word radical come from? Third, why is being radical not easy? Okay, so why is being radical not so easy? What are the potential dangers and benefits of being radical? Does the herd appreciate radicals? Why or why not? It's a bit of a trick question. Maybe not so much a trick question, but something to think about here. 6, what does radical study look like? How is it better than half-hearted review? 7th, what does it mean to be a disciple? All right, so what is a disciple? What does that mean to be a disciple? Now, we've argued that everyone is a disciple, whether you know the name of your teacher or not. Do you agree or not? Explain. And finally, do you agree with this statement? Wouldn't you want to be a disciple of the best teacher ever? Why or why not? See what you come up with.